Bento, your 2020 NIAP president. Thanks everyone for being here. We've got a great turnout today. A quick reminder for everybody that wants to receive CE credits, you must be logged into the Zoom for the full hour, and there's going to be 2 quick multiple choice questions that'll pop up that you have to answer as well, which is a requirement by the Department of Commerce. Also, throughout the presentation, if you have any questions for Ron, please use the Q&A button, and hopefully we can get to a lot of those at the end. And just a quick thank you to Ross Dolan of Great Western Bank for helping coordinate this event and get Ron with us today. So with that, a quick introduction on Ron. He is the Regional Outreach Director for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and his primary responsibilities are really tracking business conditions across the 6-state 9th District Reserve. He specifically focuses on employment and wages, along with construction, real estate, and consumer spending. And he also works a lot of outreach with businesses and industries like ours. I talked to him briefly before we started here, and he said that he can guarantee to tell us where the 10-year Treasury is going to be in 2021, where cap rates are going, and he has all the answers. So we're excited to have him here today. And Ron, and with that, I'll turn it over.
Great, thanks, Anders. I appreciate that very much. And I have all of that information at the very end, so you have to stay glued until the very end for me to give you all of those. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to the group today. Every chance I get to be able to talk about the economy, hopefully it helps everybody. Hopefully it'll help folks that are watching today. It's also going to help the bank, because every time I get in front of a business community, there's a good opportunity for me to connect and to hear from you all about what's happening in the economy. So there's also going to be, along with the 2 attendance questions that you're going to get, I also have an interactive survey that folks are going to be able to help give the bank some information about what you see in the economy. So hopefully by the end of this, we'll all learn something. Before I get started too far, hang on, let me get rid of a box here. I have to give you my disclaimer. This is my bozo slide, what I like to call. Basically, the views presented here are mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. So if I happen to say something inaccurate or foolish, you have to blame the clown and not the circus. So what am I going to talk about today? So the first thing I'd like to do is kind of give you a little context for the data challenge and the need for better real-time information in this current environment. I'm going to tell you about who's been affected in the pandemic and to what extent. And I'm going to do so mostly through some survey work that we've been doing, but I'm also going to use some traditional data as well as some new data that the Minneapolis Fed's been working hard on to get a better real-time idea of what's happening in this COVID environment. At the end, I'm also going to talk a lot about consumer sentiment and how it relates to the virus right now and what that means for the outlook for the economy going forward. I'm also going to do an interactive survey that's going to help fill some of those blanks in terms of real-time sentiment, in terms of this industry specifically. So I'm going to get us logged on. I'm going to take a minute or so to get us logged on. I need you to grab your phone while I finish this. I'm going to present a lot of information to you over the course of the next 45, 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A. I'm going to focus on a lot of macro themes, so I'm asking you not to worry too much about individual details of a specific chart. I'm going to share this PowerPoint later. You can have a much deeper look at it later, but I'm going to try to keep things going. So the first thing I need everyone to do is to be ready to take this survey, because this is really your opportunity to let us know about how you view current economic conditions. The beauty of this is that it's not just information for us, it's information for everybody watching. So as we do the survey, you're going to see immediate real-time results populate your screen. So here's how we get logged on, and the best way I can describe this is a survey is only good as many people as can take it. So if we can get 80 to 90, 100% participation for everyone that's here, the results themselves will be a lot more trustable. So if you have your phone, I want you to go to step 2, and you're going to send a text to the person that is 22333. Consider that your mother or your dad, your Aunt Alice. That's the person. And you're going to text the word Minneapolis, and if it capitalizes, that's just fine. So after you type in the word Minneapolis in the text screen. You're going to hit send, and you're going to watch for a little pop-up message that says you've been logged into a survey. Either Anders or Tony or Stephanie, I need you to give me some verbal cue that folks are having success logging in. If folks maybe just want to say success in the chat box, I just need just a little bit of indicator that folks are having success logging in, just in case.
Ron,
And while we're
it is working. I can
Sounds great.
see
So when you get that pop-up box, some people are tempted to hit that little hypertext link in the pop-up box. Don't do that. Stay in text mode. All the responses to the questions are going to be via text. Okay, and if there's a chance, if we could get step 2 and step 3 in the chat box, that way anybody that enters later or is having any difficulty will be able to have those instructions still available to them so they can try to get logged on. With that, I'm going to get going. Okay, so how to not measure the COVID economy. And I say that a little tongue-in-cheek, but kind of not also. So before the pandemic, the first slide that I would typically offer, just for context, is this gross domestic product chart. And the utility is that it's a very big measure of how things generally are. The problem is we're in a pandemic environment where real-time information really is not very available. So if you look at the black line here, that's the US GDP figure. So I think everyone's familiar. We saw a really steep decline in Q2 and a really steep updraft in Q3. I think the way I would think about this particular move over to Q2 and Q3 is that we're still here. We're still in the, I wouldn't think about it as a huge drop and a huge bump up, because I don't believe that the huge bump up is likely to continue at that trend. I think what's better to think about is, I think what I hear from businesses is that we're kind of more in a COVID mindset, in that things are still lower than they were pre-pandemic. They've definitely improved, okay? The problem with us right now, though, is the Q3 measure only takes us through September. And we know a lot has happened since then. And so there's a lot of information that we don't know about what's going on right now. If you happen to look at it from a state level, we know even less. The most current measure for GDP for states, as I have here for Minnesota and Wisconsin, is still at Q2. That's a lifetime ago in terms of trying to understand what's going on right now. So what's happening in the real estate market? I would say I have even poorer information on that. I generally kind of consider real estate to be the little black book. So there's very little centralized data in the public domain for me to look at in terms of really trying to understand real estate trends. A lot of it's not that there's not a lot of information, but a lot of it is disaggregated. It's tightly held in private hands, tends to be pretty spendy. And when it does come out, it's spooned out in pretty small helpings. And for that reason, it's pretty hard for me to verify data that would seem to measure the same thing, and again, in any kind of real-time sense. And in the 9th district, I'm required to pay attention to a geography that runs roughly western Wisconsin and the UP of Michigan, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Montana. And in that territory, the only thing I can get macro data on in any kind of sense is in the Twin Cities. So it's hard for me to get information on Sioux Falls or Fargo or Billings, other markets that I would be hypothetically interested in. To give you one example of that, this is for the Twin Cities. And so for the industrial vacancy rate, I think everyone here is familiar with a lot of the major reports that come out on a quarterly basis. So the industrial rate, which I would consider probably the most stable of all of them, among these 4 reports, we see a variation in terms of vacancy from roughly 4.5% to 7.5%. And I would say even the rate of direction that they are identifying also varies between them. So what I would say in terms of real estate information is there's a lot of room for interpretation on how things are really kind of falling out right now in the industry. Frankly, I think most of the people on this call know more about the inner workings of the real estate market right now than I do. So frankly, I'm going to talk about more other things, and I'll let you hopefully fill me in more with some of the interactive survey stuff. You can inform me maybe more about some of the trends going on specifically in your industry. So how else do we gauge what's happening in the COVID economy? Right now, what I'm going to show you is some survey work we're doing, as well as some better real-time data. Specifically, we've done a lot of recent surveys, roughly about 11 or 12, just since the start of the pandemic, to try to get a much more granular and real-time idea about what's going on in Minnesota as well as those other states. We do a general business survey. The most recent one was in early October. Again, it covers that 6-state region. The majority of responses are in Minnesota, roughly about 600 responses. We also do a construction survey that I think I'll talk a little bit more about. It might be a little bit more relevant for this particular audience. We did the most recent one at the end of October, so that's particularly recent. Again, 6 states, but the large majority of responses were actually from firms in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Roughly about 400 responses to that. Importantly, I think, is that we also asked about the 4 different sectors for them to kind of essentially identify what sectors they were working in, which I thought would be interesting for this audience as well. So to go back to the first survey that I mentioned, the general business survey done in early October, what I want to kind of give you some context in is measuring what's happening in the COVID environment is really kind of tricky right now. We typically ask for year over year, but in this environment, we're also very interested to see if things are happen to be getting better during this process of the pandemic itself. So we asked firms about their Q3 revenue compared to 3 different time frames: the last year's third quarter, the second quarter of this year, so we have some idea of the progress during the pandemic, and then we wanted to know what their outlook was for the upcoming fourth quarter. Basically, what we can see here is that there's a lot of negative revenue trends still in place among businesses in general. They've worsened significantly since last year, not a big surprise. In terms of the second quarter performance, fairly even, still net negative in terms of revenue trends, but much more balanced. And we actually saw a fair number of firms see quite strong revenue increases even. But in terms of the coming fourth quarter, we see that the net negative is still in place there with regards to the future. A couple of things that I want to point out in terms of who's been affected. So we asked firms to kind of give us some demographic data, so we had a better idea of who may be affected and kind of how this is playing out in a little bit more detail. And what I would say is a couple of things that really step out is that size matters. For the most part, we've seen very consistent results with regards to firm size. Not that big firms aren't affected. If you were to see only the top bar here for the largest firms, you would say this is a catastrophic outcome. It's only less catastrophic in the context of smaller firms. So what we're seeing is significantly or notably higher negative results in terms of trend. And again, here I'm only comparing the third quarter to the second quarter. So during the pandemic, what's been happening is that we're still seeing more negative results among smaller firms compared to large firms. You know, it's not dramatic. Everyone's seeing some effect, but we are seeing effects get worse as we see in smaller firms. Smaller firms are also seeing, and it's not reflected here, but if I were to splice this data a little bit more, smaller firms tend to see larger revenue declines as well. The other thing that has mattered is the sector matters. Again, every sector is feeling some pain, but particularly in terms of those industries that really depend on crowds, face-to-face consumer interaction, those have really seen the largest impact kind of really since the pandemic and the number of surveys that we've done. In terms of recently compared Q3 compared to Q2, what I did see though is some of these middle ones here that actually saw fairly large increases, still some negative outcomes as well, but some of those that were hurt early in the pandemic, healthcare, accommodation, retail, some of those actually have seen some fairly strong bounce backs in terms of these being much more negative in earlier surveys. So what about the construction sector? I know that's something that this audience in particular has more interest in. The first thing I wanted to show you is that we get some data from Dodge Data Analytics that I think is pretty interesting. And what we see here is that there is, I think as most were familiar, coming in to the end of 2019, we were really on a very nice upslope. Now this is in order to smooth the data because construction activity tends to be pretty lumpy and seasonal. This is a smooth rolling annual average, but we're seeing that things were really cresting beginning of this year, end of last year. And what we've seen since then is that there's been kind of a relatively relatively modest trundle down in terms of thinking of this as we're still not far off levels that we saw a couple of years ago. So again, I don't think we haven't fallen off a cliff, but there's been some clear slowing. And I think the issue is, where's this trough going to end? That's kind of where our construction survey, we hope, is kind of help maybe filling in some of those. I can't give you the actual answer to that, but I'm going to show you some slides that I think might give you some insight to it. Again, we asked firms to give us their revenue trends over the last 3 months. And again, here it gets to late October survey. So we asked them to compare August, September, and October to 3 periods. The same period last year, the previous 3 months, so May, June, July, and then their expectations over the coming 3 months through January. And what I would say here is that we're seeing a lot of lumpiness. In the first 2 measures compared to last year and compared to the previous quarter, we see that a lot of firms are seeing some growth, a lot of firms are seeing some decline. And that is really, really quite even for both periods. What I would say is the expectation for the coming 3 months is more negative than the other 2. Now, some of that might have to do with seasonality. You know, construction firms tend to slow down during the winter, so there might be some of that factor. I'd be hard pressed, though, to put a positive spin on the expectations, though, for the coming 3 months. We also asked firms in this survey to identify what sector they did most of their work. I thought folks would be interested in this. Generally speaking, what we saw is the best results in residential building, the most positive recent activity, as well as the best future expectations. We saw that the non-residential and commercial sector was probably seeing the hardest, but not far off from industrial. I think both of those have to do with the fact that a lot of our survey respondents were from Minneapolis. We know that things are a little bit, conditions here are concerning, I think, to a lot of people, in part because of the continued telework and the lack of presence of a lot of downtown workers. I think that probably has a chilling effect on any new construction. But in general, again, we are seeing some positive prospects in the residential sector, and I hear that not only in the Twin Cities and Minnesota, I hear that really across the 9th District. One of the things that is really, I think, affecting everyone's revenues is that we are continuing to see a fair level of cancellations. So we asked them to basically compare the level of cancellation and delays currently, again, that's late October, to what they were seeing in July. In July, we asked them about how things were compared to May. Generally speaking, we haven't seen a lot of movement in these levels of cancellations and delays. Basically, in both private and public projects, we're seeing certain level of cancellations, you know, between 30 to 45% or so, depending on private or public. So we're seeing higher levels in private, both for cancellations and delays, but both are being affected. And I haven't seen a lot of change in any of these measures compared to July. Equally important, I think, and for us, you know, because we consider construction to really be a bellwether kind of sector. We're very interested in sentiment. I think there's probably no other sector out there that really kind of is a projection of confidence in the future. You're not going to build you're not going to build a new house, you're not going to build a new office tower unless you have some confidence that you'll be able to pay for that building on a long-term basis. And so we really do like to pay a lot of attention to this sector and what they see in terms of future building projects. And what we're seeing is, again, somewhat of a contraction, particularly for public projects, more so than private projects. So that's a little bit of good news, is the private project pipeline maybe improved a little, but improved from a pretty poor standpoint. So it's still net negative in terms of contraction. It's a little bit improved from July, but in general, what I'm hearing is that, you know, pre-pandemic, we heard about a very strong pipeline for future work. Now we're hearing about concern for work in 2021 and 2022. Again, I'm not going to show you the chart, but as a breakdown among the industries, among the sectors, housing is clearly the leader. All of the other 3 sectors seem to have, again, more of a contractionary outlook in terms of pipeline. Housing being modestly positive. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about what I know about the current economy and the current environment in terms of firms. Now I'm really interested. This is where you get to teach me about what's happening more in this particular sector of real estate. So I need to know, excuse me, I don't need to know your outlook for the next 3 months. That's coming. Right now, I need you to first if you could describe your overall revenue activity at your firm since September. So roughly over the last couple of months, how would you characterize activity? And here would be a good time, either Anders or Tony, while folks are thinking about their response and hitting their answer, while we see results roll in, this is actually a really good time for me to take any questions that potentially have rolled in. The other thing too, for those that are watching, if anyone wants to give me some additional insights on what their answer is, you know, if things are really positive, I'd love to know why. Are there things that are happening that you see maybe there are pivots? If there are things also that you see during my presentation that you want to offer some input on, I would love to get the chat box after this just for any additional intelligence. So maybe if there are any questions, we'll wait until I get to the next question. But what I see here on screen is quite positive, maybe more positive than I would have expected, in that this is a real net positive over the last 3 months. And that's great to hear. Okay, so we've asked about recent. Now what about future? Again, from a sentiment standpoint, this is something the Fed pays a lot of attention to in terms of what you are expecting, what your visibility is. So what do you expect based on the previous period? How do you see the coming 3 months? And again, here in the chat box, if there are any issues with seasonality that affect your answer, I'd love to know a little bit more about that if you're willing to offer. And out of the chute, I would say we're seeing definitely lower expectations. This is something, so I've done a fair number of webinars just in the last couple of weeks, and this is a very persistent theme that I've seen. Responses have been more positive about recent activity than I expected. But based on that, I've seen that the sentiment going forward has also been lower than I would have expected based on what, you know, the previous question offered. And the same thing is playing out here. If folks maybe even in the Q&A period want to offer me some insights on that, I would love it, or in the Q&A box. Any questions in the Q&A box that you'd like me to tackle right now?
Not right now, Ron.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Tony. We'll keep her moving. So other findings. So I'm not going to show you any more charts with regard to the construction survey, but there are a few findings that I just want to make people aware of right now. And that is that construction firms were still seeking net labor. That's not the case across all sectors, though we are hearing of a firming of employment in general. But the other thing they were very adamant about is they can't find labor. So they may be looking for it. That's a net positive for the economy. They're having difficulty finding labor, really tight availability right now. That is also not new. That was probably the single most repeated refrain in terms of business activity, is that they could be, before the pandemic, excuse me, is that they would be busier if they could find more labor. Sounds like that's still a problem right now. Wages are...
Ron,
Yeah.
I don't want to backtrack at all, but when you talk about housing just a second ago, were you meaning residential, single, and multifamily, or just single family?
A good question, and one I can't technically answer. It's kind of how you sort yourself. So when we ask firms to identify who or what sector they do most of the work in, I assume that they answer non-residential for anyone building multifamily, but I don't know that. We do, a couple of our major partners that get this survey out are the home builders associations. So I think that residential has mostly to do with single family, but I can't guarantee that those that are working in the multifamily space aren't checking the residential box. Okay, so the fact that there might be some crossover there means that residential might be a little bit more vague, but I think the general picture that I offered there is probably accurate to single family building. I hope that answered it.
Thank you.
Okay, so wages are also going up, and they're going up more strongly in the construction sector than I'm seeing elsewhere. In terms of input prices, there's really two things that firms told us. They've seen very strong increases since the pandemic onset. So there were a lot of respondents that said prices rose 5, even more than 10%. But in terms of the input price expectation over the coming 6 months, is that I saw a little bit of a regression to the middle. So there were a few that said they didn't see much inflation at all, that said they were going to see a little. I saw more though that responded that they've seen very high price inflation in materials, to say that it's probably going to come down a little. So I would say it's a little bit more in the middle than what it was in terms of what they've seen previously. Solvency in this sector also is quite strong. Among 400 construction firms, only about 3% said they weren't sure that they could make it another 3 months under the current environment. And that's, again, that would be even smaller in normal times. But the good news is we've seen that number slowly come down. In the construction sector, it's also significantly stronger than general businesses, which tends to be in the low teens for the same question. Now, what about your firm? So these things are really important to the Fed in regards to labor and wages. I'm curious about what's happened with you in terms of workforce first. So over the last couple of months, what's happened to staffing at your firm? And I'll take a little bit of time to let you a little bit more complex answers here. And it looks like we're seeing mostly stable staffing. And actually, that's a good answer for us. We're really worried about net hiring ultimately, but stability in this environment is, I think, really quite good news. And even beyond that, it looks like there's just generally hiring across the board if there's going to be really any changes. I don't see anybody cutting net workers. Fantastic. I would say that's generally a little bit more positive than I hear from other sectors. Other sectors, especially in accommodation, retail, food and beverage, tends to see, as you might expect, significantly different results than this. Okay, what about the future? Do you expect really any changes between now and the end of January? Looks like a lot of stability and hiring here as well. Going back to the revenue question, this is also where I saw a little bit of different response, at least with some, not ironically, but I was with a CPA audience. Those people were particularly positive, more so than I expected. So it's really useful for me to kind of get out and about to different sectors to really start gauging kind of the differences that people see on the ground. So things like this are really useful. And if I didn't mention it previous, I'm one of the few people in the bank that are tracking kind of real-time conditions, but I have the direct bat line to President Kashkari. So with the feedback I get on things like this, go directly to him. And again, I would say generally positive outlook for employment. That's a great signal. What about wages? So I'm curious about what's happened to average wages since the onset of the pandemic. And again, for the Fed, we follow wages very closely, as you might imagine. For us, wage increases over 3% is above trend. So that's really what I'm interested in. If I were to do this for a construction survey, they'd be like 3%. That's average or worse than average. So I'm curious in the real estate sector, what does that mean? And here we're seeing the interesting part about wages here is that wages tend to be really sticky. And what we saw in the pandemic is that they've been less sticky than they historically have been. In the Great Recession, you tended to see employment cuts and wage freezes, and not nearly as frequent of wage cuts. And early in the pandemic, we've seen 20, 25, even 30% of survey respondents say that they've seen wages cut in some fashion. We're seeing that number, we're seeing a lot of reinstatement of those wages, but the pandemic really, I think firms are taking a little bit different approach. I think they realized how important trying to retain workers was, and I think they've been trying to really do anything they could to kind of keep people employed, even if it meant cutting wages. Okay, so that's recent, and I would say maybe especially as positive as things were, I was expecting maybe a little bit higher wage increase. Again, one of the reasons I ask is it's better to find out. What about future wages though? What do you see over the coming 12 months? And if any questions have come in, good time here. Otherwise, we'll let the horse race unfurl. And what I would say is it looks like for the most part, we're expecting modest wage increases. But wage increase, I think that's a good signal, a very good signal. But I would call overall the fact that roughly 1/3 or so are expecting little or no change. Pretty notable in terms of what we maybe think for inflation purposes. So let's talk a little bit about employment, unemployment, and a few other measures. So I think everyone's familiar with kind of what's happened in the employment environment, at least in a broad sense. But if you take a look at the left up, and here we have a attendance question here. If folks could respond to that, I'm just going to move it off to the side if that's all right. Oh, sorry about that. See if I can move it over here. So for the left chart, what you see is you got the big decrease that everyone's familiar with during the heart of the pandemic or the onset of it. And we saw a fairly quick bounce back, particularly when state economies started reopening again. But what I would tell you is that generally speaking, we're hearing and seeing of a trajectory that is starting to flatten more than it was early in the pandemic. So again, right here, this is an index chart. So basically I'm tying all employment levels to 100. So we need to get back to 100 simply to be back to pre-pandemic levels. And the trajectory right now looks like it's really elongating, that it might take us a little bit to do that. I'm going to move this over. And for the right chart, what you see is that what I try to give people an idea is that, like anything else, a state level really masks a lot of variation. So I thought folks might be interested in knowing what employment trends are among the 5 metros in Minnesota. And what you're seeing is that there really is a different trajectory and level with all of them. With Minneapolis, St. Paul maybe seen, among the lower rates of growth among the 5, and also a trajectory that looks like it's not changing anytime soon. In terms of the construction employment index, this is interesting to me in that you really saw a drop in employment in Minnesota well before the pandemic ever hit. So here's where the start of the pandemic is. We were already starting to see a little bit of contraction in employment, which was a little surprising to me given that the pipeline for projects really seemed to be very full. So again, and this is adjusted for seasonality as well. So we saw a little bit different trend in Minnesota compared to Wisconsin. I would say they're both generally on the same track, a little bit, not quite the same bounce back either in Minnesota as we've seen in Wisconsin, but again, all of them below where we were pre-pandemic. In terms of unemployment, kind of the same thing, in the inverse. We've seen a huge spike in unemployment, exceeded Great Recession levels. We've seen a very steady decline in unemployment, all the way down to 6% in September. The thing I would tell you is that there's a lot of labor market anomalies that are underneath that general trend. For example, the one thing I'll mention is that the most recent number for September, the unemployment rate went down to 6% from 7.4%. The Department of Economic Development and Employment and Economic Development mentioned that the large majority of that drop was the result of the fact that labor force participation is falling. So people are just not looking for work, and that brings down the unemployment rate. I look a lot at labor force participation. I did particularly before the pandemic. I think it's really relevant. It's going to be really relevant going forward. The reason is we were seeing a very long and steady decline in labor force participation, some of it due to aging, some of it due to other things that I don't have time to get into here. The good news before the pandemic is we were starting to see signs that it may have pivoted and was possibly starting a long-term trend up. Don't know how steep, but then the pandemic hit, and of course, we've seen a very significant drop in labor force participation. And how quickly that bounces back, even with things like a vaccine on the horizon, not clear, because the longer people are out of work, the harder it is to get back into work for lots of reasons. I also pay a lot of attention to unemployment insurance claims. There's really two things here I want to point out. We have initial claims, basically those that are applying for assistance. You saw them spike to unimaginable numbers in March and April. They've seen a slow, steady drop. What I would tell you is that at the end of this line, they're still roughly 3 times what they would normally be at this time. So we're still seeing a lot of dislocation in the labor market. The other thing I tend to pay more attention to is this big red area. Those are continued claims. Basically, those are the traditional, what I want to say, the normally counted population of people receiving unemployment benefits. The other colored bars, the green and the purple, are the additional claims that we're now counting due to the CARES Act and the expanded eligibility of unemployment benefits. Basically, we've seen more than 1 million initial claims. The continuing claims, the red portion, they are now, if I would have updated this chart over the last couple of weeks, the continuing claims now are slightly below the Great Recession peak, which is about 137. But if you include the other expanded eligibility programs, we're still significantly above what the Great Recession peak was for people receiving unemployment benefits. How does that compare to unemployment? The Great Recession jobless peak was roughly 8.5%. The peak in the pandemic was about 10%. Okay, that's despite the fact that unemployment benefits were 3 times higher during the pandemic than they were in the Great Recession. And now we still have more people receiving unemployment benefits. Our current unemployment is 6%. So there's a lot of misalignment right now with the population that we know is underemployed or unemployed and what the actual unemployment rate is. In terms of construction, very quickly, kind of the same outlook. I can't give you the expanded eligibility claims; those aren't available in terms of sectors. But what you see is that there's the 2019 unemployment benefits is the red line. Everything above it is the excess that we're seeing during the pandemic. Okay, so we're seeing that many more are receiving unemployment benefits that were in the sector previously. This despite the fact that we have reported really tight labor conditions in the sector. So it really speaks about difficulties in the matching process. We can talk maybe a little bit more in the Q&A about that if interested. So I want to spend about the last 10 minutes or so talking about the economic outlook, the COVID virus, and consumer sentiment. First, I want to just kind of maybe give you a kind of a rough idea of how I think about where we've come during the pandemic. So everyone's familiar with the April plunge that we had in the lockdowns. Then in June and July, there was really some relative strength and bounce thanks to 2 things. We reopened the state economy, so more businesses were open at a larger capacity. But we also had a really big federal stimulus package, not only to households, but also to businesses through the PPP loan program. Since then, I would say that overall things are a little mixed. I think we have clear indication that some sectors are recovering more quickly than others, and we have seen, I think, some clear evidence that the third quarter was quite strong. I didn't mention anything about this, but the manufacturing indexes right now are really quite strong. But I would also say that the survey suggests what I mentioned earlier, is that there's this kind of this COVID mindset. I don't think that people are feeling, I don't hear that people are saying there's an absolute surge behind that Q3 number. I think there was a little bit of an expected bounce, and what we expect from here out is still a little bit unclear to me. In part because there isn't a stimulus specifically in the offing, but we all know that we've gotten the best news since this pandemic has started regarding vaccines. What does that mean for the outlook, particularly given that we don't really know exactly what the timeline or the efficacy of the vaccine is? What I would tell you is that we're looking more and more for clues regarding consumer confidence. So right now, what I'd like you to do is take off your business hat and put on your home hat, your consumer hat, because we think the consumer is going to have a big role to play in terms of where things go from here. And I'm interested in know how COVID has influenced your consumer habits. So in terms of mobility first, kind of how out and about are you? I would love to know right now, how would you consider or gauge your out and about levels compared to to pre-pandemic levels? So it looks like right now, I would say this is a fairly typical crowd, maybe a little bit more cautious than I have seen in other places. But generally speaking, across the board, every audience I do this with, we are seeing levels of mobility that are either moderately, kind of on a net basis, or even more so below what pre-pandemic levels were. Now, again, not surprising, but I think it's just useful to really make sure that we're kind of talking about the same things here. Okay, we know that mobility is not the same as spending. We know that spending, we can spend a lot of money without ever leaving our house. But tell me how you would describe your current spending levels as a consumer compared to pre-pandemic levels. Again, I generally tend to see 15 to 25% that are still spending at pre-pandemic levels. I'm an A1, I would say, or a B, a B1. I'm kind of in the middle of those two. I thought I would be saving more money, given that I am also obviously working from home. Just hasn't happened. Too many kids in college, I guess. But it looks like in general, not that everybody is, but the large majority of people on this call are spending slightly to moderately below what they normally would. Why do I ask that? I ask that in part because in our survey work, I still hear this a lot. I think what we need to do is just open up the economy and things will get better. I'm curious about that. I'd like to get your opinion on that. So if we opened up the economy, if we eliminated all restrictions on business, on our ability to gather as crowds, if we took away social distancing, irrespective of what was happening with COVID trends, what would happen to your current mobility and spending? Would they return? Would we act as if there's no virus? Or maybe we would increase some, maybe some would actually reduce. If we took off all the blinders, maybe that would actually induce them to get more safe. So it looks like, if I remember right, the previous question had a higher share actually that were at pre-pandemic levels. So we're actually seeing a small decline there. 15% would actually also peel back a little bit. Otherwise, we're seeing about 40% would increase their mobility slightly or moderately. Okay. In general, how I would characterize this is that we wouldn't see much change. Why do I ask that? I think mostly because my bank president has been out and fairly adamant about this, and I agree wholeheartedly. The recovery is likely to be consumer driven. The reason in part is because this hasn't been an economic, the recession hasn't been because we saw an economy that was fundamentally flawed. This was a health thing that has rolled into the economy. And it really is going to depend on consumer confidence. And that we've seen is that consumers are paying attention to infection and mortality trends. What's also happening because of quarantines and things of that nature, it's actually impeding our production capacity as well. You have worker problems with regards to daycare issues, virtual K-12, the quarantining of workers or exposure. So we know that there's also complications that the virus has done outside of what it does for our own interest in staying safe. It's made it harder to run a business, period. real lasting economic recovery and particularly strong growth, it's going to start with controlling the virus until we have that effective vaccine already out there. You know, again, I think everybody is over the moon at what we've heard in terms of recent news with regards to the vaccine. What I would say is that the bridge from here to there is still unknown. I think there's hope that it can start rolling out in the coming months, March, April, May. I think there's a lot of complexity to doing it. And as I understand some of the distribution and storage concerns with regards to the vaccines that are on the forefront, I think this might be a lot more complicated than we think. So really what we have to do is worry about what we do from here to when the population is covered. So addressing the virus will matter. And the longer that we don't control the virus simply means we're in for a longer and slower recovery. What's happening to COVID trends right now? I think the good news is that Minnesota is better than its neighbors. The bad news is our neighbors are among the worst in the country and world in terms of infection rates. So on the left chart are the new cases per thousand. I also want to point out, and I should have done this earlier, we have a COVID dashboard, this little graphic here on the bottom. We have a dashboard of a lot of data, not only related to COVID, but also related to a lot of consumer activity. A couple charts that I'll show you here shortly. I would highly recommend a quick search, minneapolisfed.org dashboard. You should be able to find this very quickly. A lot of very interesting data on there I think you'd find useful. In terms of hospitalizations and ICU admits, in Minnesota, also the wrong trend that we would be hoping for in terms of controlling the virus. What we see is that the better real-time information we get, we're seeing more connections with COVID trends and consumer activity. A couple of the things that you would see on our dashboard, we get Google mobility reports. So for retail and recreation, we're looking at these states, and the utility of some of these charts is that you can toggle on and off these various states and geographies. So you can clean this up or have as much detail as you want. Generally speaking, the trend has been softer, lower among retail and recreation. We also get seated diners data from Open Table, and from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, again, the trend is lower. So a quick final note. There is still a lot of debate about policy and economic impact. You can't turn on the news or look at the news on your phone without masks and other things being debated about their efficacy. I think what I would send you away with is that consumers as a group have shown sensitivity to infection trends, and they're changing their behavior accordingly. Consumer spending is 2/3 of the economy, and if they're going to be influenced by the degree and control of containment, doing so seems to be in the best interest of our economy. Business operations are also affected by virus rates simply because the more people that are affected, the more people that have this and are in contact tracing or other things, the more it's going to disrupt businesses. So controlling the virus to us, to the Minneapolis Fed, that's an economic truism. It's not a political one. It's really hard for us to imagine how we get a robust recovery without it. Again, acknowledging that there's hopefully a vaccine not that far away, the period between now and then should not be a throwaway period for us. The higher we are when we hit that vaccine, the better able we will be to really jump off of that landing space as well. In my mind, adjusting to an effective vaccine, that'll be easy. We just don't know how far away it is though, and its efficacy is not proven. So I think if we're simply looking to just muddle our way through that, I think that's a lost opportunity. These are the things that the Minneapolis Fed pays an awful lot of attention to. Your input on this is really helpful. It does help us understand not only how businesses are doing, what you see in the future, you're giving us a better idea also of how you're reacting as a consumer. So these are really helpful things for us. I hope I've been able to give you some food for thought, as well as some better intelligence on how things are. With that, I'll leave this screen up for just a little bit, but I would love to get any questions that folks might have.
We're on the seminar is obviously focused on pandemic, and that's the proper way for it to be. What else moves the numbers in our market? What does it take? the week or two of civil unrest occurred? Does that move the numbers? And looking on a forward basis, is there something
Yeah.
that we can say? You know?
What I would say is it's difficult for me to answer specifically because the part of the problem in measuring some of the things that have been going on is, again, that real-time surveying for those kinds of specialized impacts are tough even in a longer term environment, data environment. But what I can tell you is if you go to our COVID dashboard, if you look at some of the measures that we have with regards to Minneapolis, what I see persistently is that Minneapolis tends to underperform the state. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think partially it is because density tends to matter. And I think with regards to some of the downtown activity and office buildings and things like that, I think some of that has had a real dampening effect. I don't think there's any question that the unrest that Minneapolis has also seen is one of the reasons that there's not a lot of people downtown as well. So I think there has been an effect. What's really hard for us to know is how to tease out exactly what that effect has been. So again, you might get a few more insights in terms of the general trends of Minneapolis with regards to a broader geography. Again, we see that there is that the activity levels from a consumer standpoint tend to be smaller. So I think there is an effect. Just hard to say exactly how high.
Another audience question. Just a moment while I organize it here. It's on the theme of employees coming back to the office.
Mm-hmm.
Is there activity or notes that you're seeing for Minnesota's activity for impact on things versus other states or areas?
What I'm seeing is what's happening in Minneapolis. I don't think is unlike what's happening in most major cities. There's still mostly downtown office buildings are still very low occupancy, worker occupancy. This is something that the downtown council, I think, is taking a look more at. They're actually doing a regular survey of office occupancy. The last figures I saw on that, I believe, are still under 20% in terms of office worker occupancy to what normal levels would be pre-pandemic. And so I don't think there's any question that's going to be a slow return, particularly if we don't see a decline in the virus transmission rate and hospitalizations, things like that. I can speak for my own circumstance. So the Minneapolis Fed at its peak has roughly 1,000 people at the building downtown off the river, and we haven't been to the bank since early March. Right now, they are communicating to us. They've been a little surprised, frankly, at how productive we've still managed to be in a remote environment, and because of that, they've communicated to us that unless something dramatic changes with regards to infection rates and things like that, we won't be back to the office probably until July of next year. And I think that's starting what I'm hearing some whispers about is that's not uncommon among some of their very major employers downtown. So again, it's a tough environment with regards to, you don't want those things to happen. What I hear from other sources is that that really has the rolling impact on all of the the small merchandisers on the Skyway buildings, and it just has such a cascading effect downtown that once businesses do start repopulating down there, it will be interesting to see how quickly things can rebound.
Thank you. I'm monitoring. I think we have it covered. I see a follow-up. You had made a chart or two early on, had some outstate examples, greater Minnesota examples. Is there your general feeling for Minneapolis and the metro area in comparison to outstate or greater Minnesota?
Yeah, what I would generally say is it kind of depends on, different sectors. So if you were to say to compare the tourism industry or the entertainment industry, what I'm seeing is that outstate is actually having more success in tourism, things like that. They're having more success. There's a very clear push to outdoor activity where there's space, things like that. In terms of tourism and kind of business tourism, when you think about, you know, the effect of not having Twins, Vikings, you know, all of the pro sports, the convention centers not doing what it would normally do, that's really had an outsized impact on places, on large urban places like Minneapolis, St. Paul. So I think outstate Minnesota in some respects is seen better. By the same token, they are also they are more heavily weighted into some of those sectors that are more heavily impacted, like tourism. So if you were to go up to Duluth, you're in the Arrowhead region, while the tourism sector is doing better up there than say in Minneapolis, it also depends on it more. So, and it has declined. So it's the better of the two situations in the sector, but it's still in decline and is a larger share of that economy. So not clear to me which one you'd necessarily pick. There's just very lumpy effects kind of all over the place. And so I don't really see any clear winners in this in terms of where would I prefer to be. I would maybe prefer to be in the housing, in the commercial, and not the commercial, you know, and the sectors that are doing well honestly seem to be having to do with single family residential, both in terms of construction and real estate. We've seen some of those numbers just jump off the map. And I think there is maybe some move to I'll be interested to see what migration patterns are to more rural areas and what impacts that has. I think that's really what some of the long-term trends are going to suggest is, are we seeing any change in where people want to live and work? Right now, it's too early to say where that is. And Tony, if that's the last questions, that's just fine. Let me take an opportunity before I go though, and that's just to wish everyone good luck. You know, if you are a business owner, running a business I know is tough in a normal environment. In this environment, it's tough times 10. And I just want to say good luck. I'm always been very impressed at people, at entrepreneurs, and this environment, I think only the really strong are going to survive. So I want to wish resilience to everyone out there. For workers that are watching, I wish you luck as well. There hasn't been anything like this really in terms of, you know, my employment career, in looking at, you know, how many people have been affected. So if you still have a job, I'm thankful for that, and I hope you are able to do so. And again, I just want to wish everybody luck, kind of trying to get along the bridge to where the vaccine is, and maybe that things can get back to semi-normal again. And I really want to thank everyone for the opportunity today.
Thank you for being with us today, Ron. I appreciate it.
Have a great day, everyone.